Hi everyone, welcome to Bay State Forum. I'm your host, Barbara Anthony. Bay State Forum is a public affairs program coming to you from Cambridge Community Television. Today's show is about UMass Boston and some of the controversial issues that have surfaced over the past year around that public university. Earlier this year, we heard that the school was projecting a $30 million deficit. That amount was later trimmed to $10 million. We heard that amidst a building program worth billions of dollars, there were billions of dollars in deferred maintenance that was not getting done. The school's chancellor, Keith Motley, was forced to resign, and a new head guy, formerly from Bowdoin College, was picked to set things right. In the meantime, there have been some faculty cuts, courses have been canceled, a hiring freeze, sort of, and of course, tuition increases. Now, UMass Boston was founded in 1964, and it's always been primarily an urban college, a commuter school with a majority of first-generation, low-income, minority, and immigrant students. Its success is extremely important to the people of Greater Boston and all of Massachusetts. Here to talk about UMass Boston are two people who've done a great deal of research and writing on the topic. Gregory Sullivan, former Inspector General of Massachusetts and now the Director of Research at the Pioneer Institute, and Laura Krantz, a well-known reporter for the Boston Globe. We did invite UMass Boston to send us a couple of representatives, but they declined to do so. And in the interest of full disclosure, I'm a consultant at the Pioneer Institute, and Greg is a colleague there. So I want to welcome Greg and welcome Laura to the show.
Barbara.
Thank you so much for being here today. So let's get started. Laura, I'm going to start with you, and I want to quote something that you wrote. I mangled it a little bit, but forgive me. You wrote in one of your articles that UMass Boston has stumbled, my word, not yours, in its quest to rise from a commuter school to a top-tier research university. So what's wrong with wanting to become the best, a top-tier university, bring research dollars in, become more famous and so on, instead of staying as a kind of local commuter school?
I don't know if there's anything necessarily wrong with that, right? But the school has to kind of do some introspection and decide whether that's truly what it wants to be, and also think about its mission, which is to educate the people in the city. And so it has to figure out whether it can do both of those things at the same time, remain accessible to the majority of people in Boston who want an affordable college degree. If it can do that at the same time as building, top tier facilities.
So why would a university want to expand? We know they're planning new buildings. They think they have a plan for expansion of students and so on. I hear what you're saying. If you can do both at the same time, but why would what is basically a commuter school want to? What's in it for them, let's say, or for the people of Massachusetts?
Right. So two things I would say. Obviously, that's a great opportunity for anyone who's studying there. Like if you're able to go to a research university, then you have students who are going to be able to be taking part in really top-notch projects. Second of all is money. I mean, you can get federal grant money to work on NIH research and things like that. So it can be financially beneficial for the school.
I mean, and it's also, so does it give them a competitive edge? What do you think?
I think in terms of prestige, national rankings and the college rankings each year to attract applicants, it would give them an advantage. But the problem with UMass Boston is that their vision of what they were planning to do, going back to their big capital plan 2009, was to basically increase the university to 2.5 times its size. 2.5 times enrollment. They were going to rise from 9,000 students in 2007 to 25,000 students. That's like
by
adding.
When? Does that
by 2025.
25,000 and
25 by 25 was the goal, and in order to accomplish this,
that's a huge goal.
And part of it was the goal of becoming a major research university. The problem is that they did so in the midst of federal funding cutbacks for research. and funds have declined. Also, their funds have declined from outside sources. That's one of the contributors to the $30 million budget shortfall you mentioned, is that they're having to self-pay about $13 million a year from their budget, and more than $30 million is being paid for the debt service that they've spent already to expand, the debt service and maintenance to expand. So those three things alone more than make up for contribute to the deficit. So you can see the practical difficulty.
Now, also, let me just go back to this 25,000 in 2025. So they do have a plan for student expansion, but I mean, many schools have plans, right, for either student expansion or student contraction.
Well, in New England, since 2007, the public schools in New England have increased enrollment by 2%, but UMass Boston to date has increased enrollment by 50%. In other words, we're an anomaly.
Well, there must be a demand for the school, but from the urban commuting students who go there, if that enrollment has been increasing.
There was a study done. It's done every 2 years by a national organization that predicts high school graduation levels each year. Some parts of the country are projected to increase the number of high school graduates. Massachusetts and New England are projected to have a decline of 12% of high school students. So in other words, a lot of the strategy of expanding depends upon attracting out-of-state students and or students from like Framingham State and other schools. So they're kind of in competition with other state institutions to some extent.
I want to talk about the out-of-states. I was going to ask you to comment. I mean, you've been very critical in some of your columns, Laura, about the school and some of their plans. And Greg, you also have been pretty critical.
I would not say that Laura Krantz has been critical.
I wouldn't say I've been critical. No, I've tried to just sort of lay things out the way they are. Yeah.
All right. So what about
we've been critical at Pioneer Institute.
Okay, so the critics are here and the reporter is here. But what about this out-of-state student business? What's wrong with recruiting? I mean, doesn't every public university do that?
Right.
And why is that?
There's nothing wrong. No, inherently no. There's nothing wrong with increasing your out-of-state students. It can be really financially beneficial. It can also be beneficial for the students, because if you're someone from Boston and you've lived your whole life here, it could be really cool to be in a classroom with people from all over the country, all over the world. On a more practical level, the school does it because those students are paying a higher tuition. They're paying about $32,000 a year instead of around $15,000. So, but going back to what we said earlier about them sort of losing sight of their mission, back in 2011, UMass Boston did a report, and it said, this is what we're going to have to do to get to where we want to be in the future. And so there were nice things like building new buildings, and then there were harder things like increasing enrollment. And so looking back at that study now, you see that they've done all the shiny object type things. The buildings are rising, but there was a call in that study to drastically increase the number of out-of-state students to help pay for that. It also to increase the number of online education programs, things like that. And they haven't done the things that are bringing in the revenue. They have only done, or primarily done, the things that cost money.
Now, I think I read somewhere, and I don't remember if it was one of your columns or one of your reports, Craig, where, I mean, this is not unusual, but the school does have a, I don't want to call it a headhunter, but it's a recruiting firm that goes to foreign countries and gets
for international students.
And gets like 50% of what
they pay.
Tuition
the half of the
is.
first year tuition is paid. That's not unusual.
No.
But following up on what Laura said, the ability to attract students from out of state is not as easy as it may seem. And I think one of the problems with UMass Boston right now is that they have not been able to hit their targets and what they need to recruit people. Some people have said that increasing your school capital expenses by 2.5 times does it make sense in order to educate out-of-state students? And that this, I think there's something to that of the expansion. About 40% of the expansion is in-state students, about 60% is out-of-state students.
Of the numbers of students, is that correct?
So
is this sort of a situation where, so if I were from UMass Boston, I might say, we're bringing in all these people from out of state in order to be able to afford to educate the in-state students. I mean, is that the rationale there?
That's the rationale.
And what's wrong with that rationale?
Well, what's wrong is the math, because if the out-of-state students were actually paying for this expansion, they wouldn't be in a budget crisis right now.
I guess they're not paying
enough.
In other
words, and Laura pointed out that the out-of-state students pay more in tuition. Right. But if you look at the amount that they pay compared to what the university pays, all costs in, it doesn't pay for all costs in. I mean the state's paying for overhead, they're paying for fringe benefits, they're paying for capital costs and so forth. So but anyway,
the cross-subsidy argument has limits.
So one thing that's important in this conversation is the dormitory. So, like for me, the dormitory is
kind
of
about that a bit.
Symbolic of all the issues that we're talking about, right? So one thing UMass wants to do is bring in out-of-state students. When you build a dormitory, inevitably that's going to enable you to do that, right? Because local students live locally. You don't need a dormitory for them. So the fact that they want to build a dormitory is kind of shows you where they want to move.
2 dormitories, I think.
Which and so that was really controversial and still is with the neighborhood, with the state, within UMass even sometimes about going back to the mission. Is a dormitory something that fits with the mission of a commuter school? Should we be spending money on that? And then when you go to the finances, it's actually ironic because UMass has borrowed so much money, they're not really able to borrow any more right now. So the dormitory is actually being financed by a private company because they have spent so much of their bonding capacity on other projects. So that dormitory kind of encapsulates all the problems.
You mean
right.
the money's being loaned by a private company?
Correct.
Which definitely must expect some return from it.
Well, so the company is going to get the revenue that students pay to live there. So it's a kind of a self-funding project, but it's being funded by another company because UMass is a self-imposed debt cap. They say we're only going to borrow this amount of money, and they've basically hit that cap. So in order to finance this dorm, they've had to rely on a third-party company.
My understanding is that it's 2 dorms with 1,000 students
2,000 bed dorms.
So
one has been approved and it's going ahead. The other one's in a pending to see what happens in the future.
Yeah, they just finished they put the final steel beam on the first dormitory. Yeah.
So I do want to get to governance, but I also want to, before I jump over there, I want to talk about. I know you've talked a lot in your work, Greg, about deferred maintenance.
Yeah.
That and Laura, in your columns, you've mentioned this as well. So can you just explain in layman's terms what you're talking about there? Why that's a problem?
Yeah. Well, it's a problem in the following way. System-wide for UMass, they engage in a capital expansion program of about $3.8 billion, but over a decade. But over that same period, their deferred maintenance actually grew. In other words, you're building new and renovating to new status, but you're ignoring your deferred maintenance, and that's a problem.
What does that mean? Taking care of the existing buildings,
repairs.
Yeah. In other words, one of the problems that's often cited with the MBTA is that they've expanded. They expanded the Greenbush line down to Cohasset and so forth. They've expanded lines, but they've got a $10 billion deferred maintenance backlog. You say, hey, take care of what's in the ground first. You've got to pay for that first. So it's kind of a parallel with UMass Boston.
So they're not paying for it. Are they behind in their deferred
maintenance?
They're
behind. Yeah, in fact,
by a lot, or
their most recent report said that their backlog's $170 per square foot, and the New England Educators Association says that if it's over $100 a square foot, it's a crisis. So they're way over, UMass Boston, way over the, the kind of the red line limit.
And they can't borrow anymore. So so have they gone to the state for help? Has UMass Boston, where's the money going to come from?
Yeah,
we're talking billions, like
yeah,
we're a billion
yeah.
here, but pretty soon we're talking real
Yeah,
money here. So where is this money going to come from to complete what they started in this different?
Laura's has, in fact, I want to tell you something very interesting in my view. Laura Krantz has written a long series of very detailed stories about this subject matter, and it's brought about a change in state policy. The change is a very significant one. That is, the administration's taken note of this, and they've decided that they're going to now bring in a new level of review and approval of these programs. So part of this thing about asking for money, every year the UMass submits a request for money. No public institution
to the state.
Yeah, no public institution in the country pays for itself. It's always state support. So that's operating.
Yeah, so there's several different streams of state support that go to UMass. There's operating money, like you were saying. Every year, UMass goes to the legislature, and part of the state budget that they pass is money for UMass. And it's one pot of money, and then the UMass system divides it up between the 5 campuses. And that's just sort of for ongoing costs. But then big building construction projects and deferred maintenance, the ongoing upkeep of those projects, is a separate set of money. And that is what he's talking about, is now the state is going to be reviewing more closely those new projects, requests for new projects, and they're saying what they're going to do is make sure that colleges, state colleges and universities are up to date on their deferred maintenance before starting new things.
Okay, what part of state government's responsible for that?
Well, in Massachusetts, on the capital side, the UMass 18-member Board of Trustees is the body, I know you're going to talk about governance, is the body who has been approving their self-funded capital spending.
But who's above them? We know what they've been approving,
there's
now
really
that you said the state's going to get involved.
For what they have been spending themselves, in other words, not the money from the state. The money from the state is authorized by the state legislature and approved and executed by the governor. That's how that for the state money. But as I mentioned earlier in the interview, in the discussion, UMass kind of gone on its own, kind of a little rogue, going back the last 10 years. They said, hey, you're not giving us enough money. They started to spend their own money. The decision to spend their own money is a decision of the university. So there's nobody above the university. In my interpretation, and Laura can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Secretary of Education and the A&F Secretary for the state is saying, look, we are going to be insisting upon a role here in your plan.
Okay.
In other words, your spending, and the UMass spending. So that's why I mentioned what I think was a significant outcome from the Krantz stories in the Globe, and I hope some of the work that we did at Pioneer.
Well, and I think it's interesting too, because earlier this year they said that the #1 deferred maintenance project in the entire state happens to be at UMass Boston.
Is that the garage?
Which is a giant underground garage.
I've been there.
So
it's
the state
has
agreed to pay towards that project. So as a result, they're going to want some oversight.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of oversight, we don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to get on to. So there's been a change at the top. Chancellor Motley, who was very popular, I know, with students and faculty, Keith Motley, was forced out. I don't think there's any other way to put it politely. And then the former president of Bowdoin College was brought in to take charge here. So is this, first of all, what did you think about Keith's being, being removed as chancellor? Was this all his fault?
Yeah. No, I don't think. I think that it was very unfair, the way that it was presented to the general public. If you look at the numbers here, you really can't scapegoat Chancellor Keith Motley. He was greatly admired by the student body, by the university members there. He had a great reputation, and I kind of viewed it that the Board of Trustees and the President's office said, "Hey, this person couldn't handle the job. He didn't do a good job." But if you look at what's happened, I mentioned before, look, $30 million deficit. Yeah, but why? Your debt service and your maintenance is more than 30. That's your whole. And you had to hire all the new staff, $100 million in addition. I mean, how are you going to balance it? It's like they approved the Normandy invasion, but then halfway through they say, oh, by the way, there's no money for the guns and the boats, So I think that then they blame the general. No, I think that with this really, the blame goes to the top, if there's blame to be attributed.
What's that mean, the board?
The board and the president's
top is the board,
office,
right? And who's the head of the board?
The board, there's a UMass Board of Trustees, 14 members. It's appointed by the governor, and they have to approve all capital projects.
And that's the whole system.
For the whole system, and and then also the UMass president has a role in the process as well.
When you say UMass, you mean system-wide president.
System-wide,
and who is that? Is that Marty Meehan? Is that
President
Meehan?
President Meehan.
President Meehan.
That's going to be pretty interesting to watch, because I mean, it's easy to do the Monday morning quarterbacking and saying it's so and so's fault or so and so's fault. I mean, you can look to the Board of Trustees. The chair is Rob Manning. You can look to Keith Motley. You can look to issues that are no one's fault, like the quality of the construction that was from the 70s that was bad to begin with. But ultimately now it's going to come back on Marty Meehan, the UMass system president, to fix this thing. I mean, this guy, Barry Mills from Bowdoin, he's there.
Where the buck ends,
yeah, but the buck stops with Marty. So I would say, like, it's going to be interesting to see, his reputation in some respect as the system president is kind of riding on what happens at UMass Boston.
So very, very quickly, Laura, you wrote a column recently about politically connected folks from Beacon Hill receiving, over the past several years, this is just now, fairly decent paying, up definitely in this well into the six figures, administrative jobs, and we see at a time when the school was struggling and they were going to close the daycare center. That changed. They changed their mind about that. That was a good thing. But certainly the people are feeling cutbacks. So what is that an issue? I mean, how does that factor into this?
I mean,
what do you think it symbolizes?
That's kind of always been, to some extent, a reputation of UMass, right? All 5 campuses as kind of a place where the politically connected can kind of land softly, right, after they have served in the legislature or worked for an administration, and they can have kind of a nice gig, make significant money, and then retire and collect a pension. I wouldn't say that's 100% happening at every campus all the time. Definitely not. But I mean, my story had examples of times where it has happened, and so UMass has to sort of think about, I guess, if that's what they want to be known for. I think they're known for a lot of other things too, but
unfortunately, that piece.
Unfortunately, it seems to kind of keep coming up.
And in times of distress, when bad decisions have been made, it's certainly, I think, fair to focus on some of that. So I think we really do have a few minutes left. So the question is, where do they go from here? They've already started building a lot of things. I assume that's going to continue. They're going to complete the buildings that have been started. But what about the rest of this capital plan?
Yeah, very good question. That is the issue, because the university system-wide has a capital plan. Each one of the campuses has a capital plan. 5 campuses, including UMass Worcester, the medical school campus, has a capital plan. And to some extent, in my opinion, the UMass Boston situation is kind of a canary in the coal mine, because there's very similar circumstances on the horizon for all of the campuses. That is to say, very expansive capital plan. and can it really be accomplished? And UMass was the first one to kind of fall off the edge, but they really have to look at that capital plan. I don't think it's realistic. We wrote an article, we wrote some stories last year, Pioneer Institute did, about this, basically saying it's impossible for this to be accomplished.
About the whole system now.
Without billions of state aid coming in to pay for it.
And I think it's going to be interesting to see what going forward happens in the short term, right? Because they still have a $30 million deficit for the year that we just started, and
I thought later. I didn't mean to interrupt. They were saying it was 10 now.
Yeah.
Well, that was
what do you think?
That was for last year. It sort of depends on the day of the week and the phase of the moon.
I was confused
what number
about
you hear.
that myself.
But so they're going to have to start making active cuts that are going to start and have already started. And the first one was kind of a public relations disaster as far as cutting a daycare facility that cares for the kids of students and professors at UMass Boston. So if that's any indication of what's to come, it should be pretty interesting this fall to see what other programs are kind of on the chopping block.
I know that they had sent out notices to, I think, 400 of their adjunct faculty saying you probably wouldn't be hired.
Then they
and they pulled them back.
backed off that a little bit.
They backed off the daycare too. It's kind of
one thing I would note is that the new chancellor from Bowdoin, he was very frank in his assessment by saying, "Look, this is a $30 million problem. It's real problem, and it's not going to be fixed overnight." Because there was a lot of PR coming out of the UMass Public Relations Office saying, "We fixed it. It's down to 10 million. We're going to take care of it by the end of the year." Now, this new person came in and said, "No, look, I'm going to be straight. This is real, and we have to address it, and it affects things going forward." So that's commendable.
Very commendable. So maybe that's a refreshing bit of candor from the top person there, and going forward, that can't hurt. It can only help. But it sounds to me that this is a problem that is not going to be resolved in the near future. It's something that's going to take some time. I mean, it took years and years to get where we are. And it may be a change in just perspective about what the school's going to be and what are all these UMass schools going to be. And we have only about 30 seconds. I'll give you the last word, Greg.
A positive end note from my point of view is that UMass, the system of UMass, and UMass Amherst particularly, has had a tremendous record of success that everybody should acknowledge, rising up in the ranks and great achievements. This should not be overlooked. This isn't the gang that couldn't shoot straight. They're shooting straight. They just ran out of bullets.
Okay. Laura, do you want to add to that?
No.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, that's a good note to end on. So I want to thank you both for coming today. I've enjoyed the conversation a lot. It's very enlightening, and we wish, of course, UMass Boston and the whole system all the best going forward, and hopefully things will get straightened out. So thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you.
And thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you. And thank you all for watching today, and we'll see you next time on Bay State Forum.